Welcome to my channel. Welcome to that channel.
The deadly piper of Loch Carron. The rain had begun before dawn. Not with any great enthusiasm, but with the patient persistence only the Highlands could manage. It drifted across the hills in long silver curtains, blurring the line between mountain and cloud, until the whole landscape seemed painted in damp shades of green and grey. Constable Ewan Fraser considered this excellent weather. Rain kept visitors indoors. Rain discouraged paperwork. Most importantly, rain gave a perfectly respectable excuse for lingering over a second mug of coffee. He occupied the only police station in the little village of Carron Beag, a whitewashed building no larger than an oversized crofter's cottage. Officially, he was expected to patrol the district. Unofficially, everyone in the village knew precisely where to find him whenever they needed him, which was generally after he'd finished his breakfast. The kettle hissed gently on the stove. A black and white collie named Moss stretched luxuriously across the doorway, one eye half open in case anyone approached with biscuits. Outside, the wind toyed lazily with the sign above the station. Ewan poured another cup. "There now," he murmured to the dog. "If headquarters telephones, you've seen nothing." Moss thumped his tail once. The telephone rang. Ewan regarded it with profound disappointment. "It'll only be Sergeant Morrison wanting forms." The telephone rang again. It could wait. It rang a third time. Moss sighed, as though burdened by the irresponsibility of human beings. Only after the fourth ring did Ewan wander across the room and lift the receiver. "Carron Beag Police. Fraser? Aye. You've not submitted last month's livestock reports." I was still observing the livestock. There came the familiar silence that suggested Sergeant Morrison was wondering whether transferring Ewan to the city might finally cure him of his leisurely habits. "They're sheep. They move. They're sheep. They move slowly." Another silence. "Reports by Friday. If the sheep cooperate." The line went dead. Ewan smiled faintly. He wasn't lazy. Not really. He simply disliked rushing toward conclusions or paperwork. There was a difference. By 9:30, the rain had settled into a fine mist. Carron Beag began to wake. Mrs. McBride swept rainwater from outside the bakery while complaining loudly that the weather had ruined perfectly respectable scones. Old Duncan McIver occupied his customary bench outside the post office despite the drizzle, insisting fresh air was healthier than common sense. Two fishermen argued passionately over whose grandfather had caught the largest salmon sometime before the Second World War. Neither expected to convince the other. That wasn't the point. Ewan wandered slowly through the village, exchanging greetings that sounded suspiciously like gossip. "Morning, Constable." "Morning. Heard the hotel's fully booked." "Is it? They've some London fellow arriving." "Oh? Says he's buying Glenfian House." Ewan paused. That was interesting. Glenfian House had stood empty for nearly 15 years, an enormous Victorian manor perched above the loch. It possessed too many chimneys, too many windows, and entirely too much damp. Locals regarded it with affectionate suspicion. Anyone foolish enough to buy it clearly wasn't from around here. Mrs. McBride lowered her voice. "They say he's some famous musician." "Is that so?" "Piper." Ewan looked doubtful. "There are famous pipers." She gave him a look suggesting he had once again demonstrated astonishing ignorance. Apparently, the arrival occurred shortly before noon. One heard it before one saw it. Not bagpipes. A helicopter. It swept across the loch with enough noise to frighten every gull for half a mile. Doors opened, curtains twitched, dogs barked. The helicopter settled in a nearby field, flattening long grass beneath spinning blades. Villagers gathered with the cautious enthusiasm reserved for spectacles that promised either entertainment or disaster, often both. The passenger emerged wearing polished boots wholly unsuitable for mud, an expensive waxed jacket that looked as though it had never encountered rain, and a tartan scarf tied with theatrical precision. He removed designer sunglasses despite there being no visible sun. A woman followed carrying a leather notebook, then another man carrying camera equipment. Finally, two assistants unloaded an alarming quantity of luggage. The newcomer surveyed Carron Beag as though inspecting property he intended to improve. "I'm looking," he announced loudly, "for someone in charge." Several villagers glanced toward Ewan. The constable appeared not to notice. He was occupied examining an especially interesting puddle. Eventually the newcomer strode across. "You?" Ewan looked up pleasantly. "I require directions." "Nal Crucier. Glenfian House. It's on the hill." "I can see that." "That's fortunate." The stranger frowned. "My name is Adrian Blackwell." Ewan nodded politely. "Welcome. I've performed before royalty. Have ye now? I've played at international festivals. Good for ye. I've won 6 international piping championships. Aye? Blackwell waited. Nothing further happened. No admiration. No applause. No recognition whatsoever. Finally he asked, "Have you heard of me?" Ewan considered the question carefully. "I've heard of bagpipes." Several nearby villagers developed sudden coughing fits. Blackwell's smile tightened. "I'll be restoring Glenfionn House into a world-class cultural retreat. Will ye? The village should benefit enormously." "How?" "The tourists." Mrs. McBride muttered something about tourists already knowing how to buy scones. Blackwell ignored her. "I also intend modernizing the annual Highland gathering." An audible silence settled over the crowd. Modernizing. That single word drifted through Carron Beag like smoke. Old Duncan finally spoke. "What's wrong with it now?" "It's outdated. It has been outdated since 1887, so I've been told. And folk seem happy enough." Blackwell smiled, the patient smile of a man explaining civilization to primitives. "They simply don't know better." Nobody answered. One never hurried these moments. Silence often revealed more than argument. Eventually Ewan spoke. Well, I hope ye settle in." Blackwell looked faintly disappointed. He had clearly expected either admiration or resistance. Instead he had encountered polite indifference. It was somehow worse. That evening the lights of Glenfionn House shone across the loch for the first time in years. Generators hummed. Delivery vans came and went. Workmen carried crates inside, despite the worsening rain. From the hotel window, several villagers watched the activity. Predictions circulated with increasing confidence. "He'll last till Christmas. October, first proper gale." "No," said Mrs. McBride. "The house will beat him before the weather does." Ewan stirred his stew thoughtfully. Moss lay beneath the table, hoping gravity might eventually deliver scraps. Outside, somewhere beyond the mist, a lone set of bagpipes drifted across the water. The tune was old, older than memory. It rose mournfully over the loch before fading into the rain. The hotel fell strangely quiet. Even the regulars stopped talking. Old Duncan crossed himself. "Bad luck," he whispered. Mrs. McBride frowned. "What is?" "Hearing the pipers lament before midnight." Someone laughed uneasily. "Oh, don't start. I'm telling ye. It's only somebody practicing." "No," Duncan said softly. "Nobody in this village plays that tune anymore." The music stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Across the dark water, one solitary light remained burning in Glenfionn House, and though no one could have explained why, more than one villager found themselves looking away from it. The rain lingered through the night, drumming softly against the windows of the police cottage until it became part of the silence. Ewan Fraser slept lightly, as he always did when the weather turned unsettled. Highland storms carried more than wind. They carried restless thoughts, loose livestock, and, on rare occasions, trouble. Moss was awake before him. The collie stood at the door, ears pricked toward the village. "You've heard something," Ewan muttered as he pulled on an old wool jumper. The dog answered with an impatient whine. That usually meant someone was approaching. Sure enough, hurried footsteps splashed through puddles outside before an urgent knock rattled the door. Without waiting for an invitation, Angus Campbell, caretaker of Glenfionn House, burst inside. His waterproof dripped steadily onto the stone floor. "You'd best come." Ewan reached automatically for the kettle. "Tea. For heaven's sake, man. Bad enough to skip tea." Angus stared at him. "Aye." Ewan's expression changed almost imperceptibly. The easy indifference remained, but his eyes sharpened. "What has happened?" "I found him." "Found who?" "Miss Outhorn, the piper." The words settled heavily between them. Ewan quietly lifted his oilskin from its peg. "Let's go." Morning had barely arrived. Mist rolled over Loch Carron in slow ribbons, swallowing the shoreline and revealing it again only in fragments. Glenfionn House emerged from the fog like a forgotten castle, its newly cleaned windows oddly bright against black stone. Several contractors stood near the front entrance, speaking in anxious whispers. Nobody crossed the threshold. Ewan noticed that before anything else, people instinctively avoided places where death had entered. He nodded to each of them but asked no questions. Not yet. The caretaker led him through the echoing entrance hall. Fresh paint mixed unpleasantly with the smell of damp timber. Expensive furniture stood wrapped in protective sheets. Half-unpacked crates lined the corridor. The renovation had barely begun. "Study," Angus whispered. "The master wanted to inspect the old music room. Said he'd turn it into some museum." The study overlooked the loch. A peat fire had burned itself low during the night. One tall window stood open despite the cold. Adrian Blackwell lay sprawled across an antique rug. He was still dressed in yesterday's clothes, though one polished boot had come off and rested several feet away beneath a writing desk. His ceremonial silver-mounted bagpipes lay beside him. One drone had snapped clean in two. The instrument looked strangely wounded. Ewan remained silent. He never hurried into a room where someone had died. Rooms talked. They simply required patience. He crouched beside the body without touching it. Blackwell's face carried an expression less of terror than astonishment, as though he had recognized something impossible only moments before his death. There were no obvious wounds, no overturned furniture, no sign of a violent struggle, only a cracked crystal tumbler on the hearth. A faint smell lingered in the room, not whiskey, something sweeter, something floral. Ewan leaned closer. Interesting, very interesting. He stood and wandered slowly around the study. His boots made almost no sound on the worn floorboards. The open window drew his attention. Outside, the rain had left the stone terrace slick with water. He stepped onto it. One clear set of muddy footprints led away toward the gardens. Only one. He frowned. If someone had fled through the window during the storm, the ground should have preserved more than that. Instead, the prints appeared oddly neat, as though they had been made after the rain had almost stopped. Someone wanted the police to notice them. He looked back inside. The missing boot, the broken bagpipes, the open window. 3 details. None of them belonged together naturally. Someone had arranged at least one of them. Perhaps all 3. Behind him, Moss sniffed along the edge of the terrace, before stopping beneath an old stone gargoyle. The dog sniffed again, then sneezed. Ewan walked over. A tiny scrap of dark blue silk had caught on the weathered stone. He carefully removed it. Not tweed. Not waterproof fabric. Far too fine. He folded it into his notebook without comment. Voices echoed from outside. Several vehicles had arrived. The familiar growl of an engine was followed almost immediately by an unmistakable shout. "Where's that village constable?" Ewan smiled faintly. Right on time. Detective Inspector Malcolm Kerr strode through the front doorway surrounded by officers from Inverness. His expensive overcoat was already flecked with rain, and his expression suggested that everyone within 50 miles had personally inconvenienced him. "So," Kerr announced loudly enough for the entire house to hear, "we've finally managed a proper murder." No one answered. His gaze landed on Ewan. "You've touched nothing, I hope." "Only the door. I'll have professionals take over." "If you say so." Kerr mistook the calm reply for dull obedience. "Excellent. You can keep the locals from spreading ghost stories while my team solves this." Several contractors exchanged glances. One of them quietly muttered, "Too late for that." The inspector rounded on him. "What was that?" Nothing." Kerr entered the study with theatrical confidence. Within moments he declared, "Robbery." Ewan looked at the room again. Nothing appeared missing. The expensive watch remained on Blackwell's wrist. His wallet sat untouched upon the desk. An envelope containing several £1,000s for local contractors rested half open beside a ledger. Robbery seemed remarkably selective. Kerr pointed triumphantly toward the muddy footprints. "There we are. Our killer escaped through the window." Ewan said nothing. Silence was often more persuasive than disagreement. The inspector continued, "Round up every workman." One of them panicked after being caught stealing. He turned toward Ewan with obvious satisfaction. "Simple enough, even for you." Ewan merely nodded. "If that's what you think." As the officers hurried away to question frightened laborers, he drifted quietly back toward the entrance hall. People ignored a man who appeared to have nothing useful to contribute. Ewan preferred it that way. Near the front door sat a polished brass umbrella stand. Inside it rested 6 umbrellas. 5 were wet from the morning rain. 1 was perfectly dry. He studied it for a long moment. The house had been full of people during yesterday's downpour. Someone had arrived, or left, without needing protection from the weather. He smiled to himself. It was only a small inconsistency. But in villages, and in murder investigations alike, the smallest inconsistencies had a habit of growing into the whole truth. By mid-morning, word of the death had outrun every official inquiry. Karen Beag possessed no newspaper worth mentioning, but it had Mrs. Morag Sinclair, who collected facts with the enthusiasm of a magpie, and arranged them with considerably less accuracy. By the time Ewan reached the village square, 3 different versions of Adrian Blackwell's demise were already circulating. He was poisoned by smugglers. No, declared a fisherman. He found Jacobite gold. It was the ghost piper, whispered an elderly woman. My grandmother warned me about that tune. Ewan accepted a mug of coffee from the hotel proprietor without asking for it. Busy morning, the proprietor said. I've had quieter. You'll have half the village telling you what happened. I'm counting on it, the man chuckled. That's either wisdom or madness. In this village, Ewan replied, they're close relations. He carried the mug to a corner table where he could watch the room without appearing to do so. People were far more generous with information when they believed no one important was listening. Before long, Mrs. Sinclair settled opposite him. I suppose you've come to ask questions. I was mostly hoping to finish my coffee. She leaned closer anyway. I never trusted that Englishman. What made you suspicious? He smiled too much. That's disappointing evidence. And he corrected my pronunciation. That, Ewan admitted, is considerably worse. She lowered her voice. He met someone after dinner. Ewan looked up. Did he? I saw them walking toward the loch. Who was it? I couldn't tell. You've just informed me he met someone. I said I saw two people. They might both have been strangers. They might, she conceded. But one of them wore a dark blue scarf. Ewan's fingers paused around the coffee mug. Dark blue. The scrap of silk in his notebook had been dark blue. Anything else? They argued. Could you hear what they said? No. Then how do you know they argued? Mrs. Sinclair smiled with quiet confidence. I've been married 3 times. I know what an argument looks like. That, Ewan thought, was difficult to dispute. He thanked her and wandered outside. Across the street, the village postmistress was pinning letters into pigeonholes with unusual force. You've heard? She asked. Everyone has. He received 4 letters yesterday. Blackwell? She nodded. 1 from London. 1 from Edinburgh. 2 delivered by hand. By whom? I wasn't watching. You are always watching. She looked faintly offended. I don't stare. You observe. Well, she relented. A young woman delivered one. Smart coat, expensive boots. Didn't belong here. And the other? A gentleman in a tweed cap. Did he? I never saw his face. He left before I reached the window. Ewan thanked her and continued toward the church. Halfway there, he found Moss standing rigid beside a low stone wall. The collie was staring at a battered tin waste bin. What have you found? Inside lay a handful of damp paper, an empty sandwich wrapper, and something else. A torn page. Ewan unfolded it carefully. It had been ripped from an old music manuscript. Most of the notes were blurred by rain, but one handwritten sentence remained legible. He knows the truth about Glen Fionn. Nothing more. No signature. No date. He slipped the page into his notebook beside the scrap of silk. The village clock struck 11. A police Land Rover rolled into the square. Inspector Kerr climbed out looking exceedingly pleased with himself. We've got our man. So quickly. The foreman. What makes you think so? He argued with Blackwell over money. Did he? He has mud on his boots. Ewan glanced at the other workmen. Every one of them had mud on their boots. It had rained all night. The foreman also admits he entered the study yesterday evening. Yesterday, Ewan said quietly. Exactly. Kerr folded his arms, as though presenting an airtight case. We'll charge him by tonight. Ewan looked toward the hills, where the mist was beginning to lift. Sunlight briefly touched Glenfionn House before disappearing behind another bank of cloud. Something about the timing still bothered him. The untouched wallet, the carefully placed footprints, the broken bagpipes. Now a torn page speaking of a truth connected to the old house. None of it pointed toward a workman losing his temper over wages. It pointed instead to someone who wanted the murder to look simple. And in Ewan's experience, the simplest-looking murders were usually the ones that had been rehearsed the most. The foreman, Callum Ross, sat alone in the interview room at the station, with the defeated look of a man who had already decided no one intended to believe him. Rainwater still clung to the cuffs of his trousers, drying into pale streaks of dust across the floorboards. He twisted his cap between rough hands while Inspector Kerr paced before him with the confidence of someone who considered the matter settled. You threatened Mr. Blackwell. I told him he'd lose every decent workman if he kept changing the plans. So you admit there was an argument? There was. And now he's dead. Callum sighed. Aye. Kerr smiled as though the confession were complete. Ewan stood quietly against the wall, saying nothing. People rarely noticed the silent man. They noticed the loud one. I've heard enough, Kerr declared. You'll remain here until we've prepared the charge. Callum looked desperately toward Ewan. I never killed him. Ewan met his eyes. I know. Kerr barked a laugh. You know. Based on what? Village instinct? No. Then enlighten me. Ewan shrugged mildly. His story doesn't fit the room. The room? The broken bagpipes. Kerr frowned. What about them? If two men fought in earnest, there'd have been more broken than a single drone. They could have knocked them over. They could. But the instrument was lying too neatly beside him. Kerr rolled his eyes. Good grief. He snatched up his notebook. I'll solve this with evidence, instead of poetry. The door slammed behind him. Silence returned. Callum rubbed his forehead. I thought I was finished. Not yet. You really believe me? I believe you're hiding something. The foreman's shoulders stiffened. I've told the truth. Not all of it. A long pause followed. Finally Callum whispered. I promised. To whom? I can't say. You may have to. Another silence. Then Callum spoke so softly Ewan almost missed it. There was a woman. The one who came to the house. I don't know her name. What happened? I was locking up the scaffolding about 8:30. She arrived in a blue coat. Blue? Again. Did Blackwell expect her? He met her at the front steps. Were they friendly? For the first minute. And after that. They weren't speaking loudly, but neither of them looked pleased. What did you do? I walked away. You didn't see her leave? No. Ewan thanked him, and left the room. The blue silk fragment in his notebook suddenly seemed much less accidental. By late afternoon the mist had cleared enough to reveal the steep path surrounding Glen Fionn House. Moss ranged ahead, nose close to the ground, while Ewan wandered without any obvious destination. That was how he preferred to investigate. Not searching. Simply walking until something chose to be noticed. The old estate gardens had long since surrendered to nature. Rhododendrons crowded cracked pathways, and moss-covered stone benches where Victorian ladies had once admired the loch. Near a weathered sundial, Moss stopped. The collie pawed gently at a patch of wet earth. What is it? Ewan knelt. Half buried beneath fallen leaves lay a silver cufflink. Not ordinary silver. It bore an engraved black thistle surrounded by tiny musical notes. He turned it over. The initials A.B. Blackwell's. Only one. The matching cufflink had still been fastened to the dead man's sleeve. Curious. If it had simply fallen off during yesterday's walk, why had no one found it until now? He looked around carefully. The damp soil preserved more than footprints. There were signs that two people had stood here for several minutes. One pair of heavy boots, one much lighter. The lighter prints ended abruptly beside the path. The heavier prints continued alone toward the house. Ewan frowned. People did not vanish, unless they had left by another route. He glanced toward the loch. A narrow boathouse stood hidden among reeds, almost invisible from the house. He smiled faintly. Come on, Moss. The collie bounded ahead. The boathouse smelled of old timber and engine oil. A single rowing boat rested inside. Its hull was still damp, despite having been stored under cover. Someone had used it recently. Ewan ran his fingers along one oar. Fresh scratches. The sort made by hurried rowing against stone. He looked into the bottom of the boat. There, caught beneath a seat, lay a folded concert program. It advertised Adrian Blackwell's forthcoming opening recital at Glen Fionn House. Across the front, written hastily in blue ink, were 4 words. You lied 20 years ago. Nothing else. No signature. No explanation. Only accusation. Ewan folded the program carefully into his notebook. A gust of wind rattled the boathouse doors. Behind him came the unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel. He turned. Inspector Kerr stood outside with 2 constables, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had interrupted someone wasting valuable police time. There you are. I was walking. I can see that. Kerr glanced at the boat dismissively. I've just received confirmation that Blackwell withdrew £50,000 before coming north. Did he? Motive established. Theft. Ewan looked at the empty boat. Have you found the money? Not yet. Then it may not have been theft. Kerr snorted, always making things complicated. He gestured impatiently toward the house. The Crown Prosecutor agrees we've enough to charge Ross. As the officers walked away, Ewan remained where he was, watching the gentle ripples spread across the loch. Money. A mysterious woman in blue, an old accusation, a hidden meeting in the gardens, and someone rowing across the loch under cover of darkness. None of it belonged in the straightforward case Kerr imagined. Somewhere in the quiet village, someone had spent years waiting for Adrian Blackwell to return. And when he finally did, they had been ready. The evening settled over Carron Beag, with deceptive calm. A pale ribbon of sunset lingered above the western hills, before surrendering to low clouds that rolled in from the sea. Lights appeared one by one in cottage windows, their warm glow reflected in the still waters of Loch Carron. From a distance the village looked as peaceful as it had the day before. Only the conversations had changed. Ewan stopped at the hotel for supper, knowing perfectly well that a plate of stew often came with more useful information than an hour of formal questioning. The dining room was unusually subdued. Even the regulars spoke in lowered voices, glancing toward the windows whenever Glenfionn House was mentioned. Mrs. Fiona Grant, who owned the hotel, placed a steaming bowl before him. "You'll waste away if you keep chasing murderers." "I've been mostly walking." "So I've heard." She hesitated. "There was a visitor asking after you." "Oh? A journalist?" Ewan looked up. "Local?" She laughed. "Hardly. London." That explained the tailored coat, the polished shoes, and the expensive camera bag, now resting beside a corner table. The woman looked to be in her early 30s, with dark auburn hair escaping from beneath a woolen cap. A notebook lay open before her, though she seemed more interested in the room than the page. She waited until Ewan had finished 2 spoonfuls of stew before approaching. "Constable Fraser?" "Aye." "I'm Charlotte Mercer." He nodded politely. "I write features." "So Mrs. Grant tells me. I was due to interview Adrian Blackwell tomorrow. I'm afraid his schedule has changed." A flicker of amusement crossed her face despite the circumstances. "So it has." She took the empty chair opposite him. "I understand Inspector Kerr isn't interested in speaking with me. He's interested in finding someone to arrest. You don't sound convinced he's found the right person." "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." Charlotte studied him for a moment. "They say you're underestimated. They say many things. They also say you solve problems." Ewan returned his attention to the stew. "The stew's better than the gossip." She smiled. "I met Blackwell several times. That caught his attention." "In London?" "Over the past 5 years." "What sort of man was he?" "Talented." She paused. "Ambitious." Another pause. "And frightened." Ewan rested his spoon. "Frightened of what?" "I never knew." "You noticed it anyway." He always looked over his shoulder. She leaned forward. 3 weeks ago he cancelled an interview halfway through because someone walked into the cafe. Did he know them? He claimed he didn't. But he was lying. Why? He kept watching the door long after they'd gone. Ewan considered that quietly. A famous musician afraid of an ordinary stranger. Charlotte nodded. It seemed absurd. Most fears do, until you discover their reason. She reached into her satchel. "I almost didn't show you this." From inside she produced a photograph. It had been taken at a charity concert in Edinburgh the previous winter. Blackwell stood in evening dress, smiling confidently for the camera. Behind him, half hidden by the crowd, stood a woman wearing a dark blue silk scarf. Ewan's pulse quickened almost imperceptibly. The scarf matched the torn fragment in his notebook. "Do you know her?" Charlotte shook her head. "I've seen her in 3 different photographs. Always with Blackwell." "No." Watching him. Ewan slipped the photograph carefully into his notebook. "May I borrow this?" "Of course." "What made you keep it?" Charlotte looked toward the rain-streaked window. "Because every time I photographed Blackwell," she hesitated. "She was there." Leaving the hotel, Ewan took the longer road home. Moss trotted beside him, occasionally disappearing into the darkness before returning without explanation. The village was quiet, too quiet. As he passed the old parish church, a faint light flickered inside. At this hour, curious. The minister rarely stayed beyond evening prayers. Ewan pushed open the heavy wooden door. The church was empty, almost. A single candle burned near the altar. Beside it lay a fresh bouquet of white heather. No note, no ribbon, just flowers. He was about to leave when something caught his eye. Mud. A line of damp footprints crossed the stone floor toward the rear vestry. Not the heavy boots of a crofter. Narrow, elegant. He followed them. The vestry door stood slightly open. Inside, drawers had been pulled out, papers disturbed, hymn books scattered across the floor. Someone had searched the room, carefully, systematically, not vandalism, looking for something. The minister arrived moments later, out of breath. "I locked this place before supper. It seems someone unlocked it." The older man stared in disbelief. "They've touched nothing valuable." "What was kept in here besides church records?" The minister frowned. "Old parish registers." "Anything else?" "There was a storage box." "What sort of box?" "It contained documents from Glenfionn House." Ewan looked up. "What kind of documents?" "They were donated years ago, when the estate changed hands." "Are they still here?" The minister searched the shelves before his face fell. "No. The box is gone." An hour later Inspector Kerr arrived in a flurry of irritation. He barely glanced around the vestry. "So now we've got a burglary." "Perhaps." "What was stolen?" "A box of estate papers." Kerr waved dismissively. Old deeds, perhaps. They've nothing to do with murder, perhaps. The inspector threw up his hands. You've become very fond of that word. It saves arguing, Kerr snorted. I've no time to chase missing paperwork. He turned to leave before adding over his shoulder. Ross will be charged first thing tomorrow. When the church door slammed behind him, silence returned. The minister looked anxiously at Ewan. Do the papers matter? I think someone believes they do. Could they explain why Mr. Blackwell came here? I hope so. As Ewan extinguished the last candle, his eyes drifted to the ancient memorial plaques lining the church wall. One name had been polished recently, not by the church, by someone's hand. The brass gleamed unnaturally bright against the others. He stepped closer. The inscription commemorated Alistair MacRae, former owner of Glenfionn House. Beneath the name was the date of his death, 20 years earlier, exactly 20 years. Ewan's thoughts returned to the message found in the boathouse. You lied 20 years ago. He stood motionless in the dim church. The murder had never been about renovations, nor money, nor even Adrian Blackwell's fame. Whatever had happened at Glenfionn House 20 years before had remained buried for 2 decades. Now someone had killed to keep it buried, or to make certain it was finally uncovered. The rain returned before dawn, sweeping in from the sea with a steady wind that bent the heather and turned the loch into a sheet of rippling slate. Ewan had slept little. The dates on the memorial plaque and the message in the boathouse circled one another in his mind, like 2 pieces of a tune that refused to resolve. Moss was already waiting at the door. You've decided we're going out, Ewan said. The collie wagged his tail once, which Ewan took as a reasonable argument. The village was only beginning to stir when they reached the churchyard. Overnight rain had washed most footprints away, but not all. Near the side gate, where an old yew tree sheltered the path, a faint impression remained in the mud. Not a boot. A narrow shoe with a pointed heel. The same kind of print he had seen near the old gardens at Glenfionn House. Someone had come to the church after the rain had begun. Someone who knew exactly where to go. He followed the track as far as the road, where it disappeared beneath the wheels of passing vehicles. So much for that, he murmured. Talking to yourself again? The voice belonged to Father Ian Morrison, carrying a basket of vegetables from the church garden. I've found I'm agreeable company. The priest smiled. I heard about the missing papers. So did half the village. I may have forgotten something. Ewan waited. There wasn't only one box. There wasn't? No. The second? I put it somewhere safer years ago. Ewan's eyebrows rose. Where? The priest hesitated. I never trusted people to leave old things alone. Father. The bell tower. The spiral staircase creaked beneath their weight as they climbed into the ancient tower. Dust lay thick across the floorboards. Spider webs stretched between heavy beams. Against the far wall stood an old sea chest with rusted iron bands. Father Morrison unlocked it with a key hanging from a chain around his neck. Inside were bundles of letters, estate maps, faded account books, and a leather-bound journal. These belonged to Alistair MacRae, the priest said, the owner of Glenfionn House, the last MacRae. Ewan opened the journal carefully. Most pages recorded ordinary estate business. Repairs, harvests, tenants. Then, about halfway through, the handwriting changed. It became hurried, uneven. One entry caught his eye. A young piper named Adrian Blackwell visited again today. The boy is gifted beyond measure, but ambition has clouded his judgment. I fear he has witnessed something he should not have seen. Ewan stopped reading. Blackwell. 20 years ago. But that was impossible. He had supposedly been in his early 20s then. Young enough to have been an aspiring musician. Old enough to remember. He turned another page. The accident by the cliffs will destroy us all, if the truth escapes. Another page had been torn out. The next surviving entry read only, we have agreed never to speak of that night again. No names. No explanation. Just silence. The most telling silence of all. By the time Ewan returned to the station, Inspector Kerr was waiting outside with folded arms. You've been avoiding me. I've been walking. You've also been interfering. I thought I was investigating. Kerr thrust a folder into his hands. The laboratory report. Ewan blinked. We sent the glass from the study for chemical testing. And? No poison. Kerr looked immensely satisfied. Natural causes, followed by a fall. Ewan looked up slowly. You believe he simply collapsed? He hit his head on the fireplace. The broken bagpipes. Accidental. The open window. A coincidence. The staged footprints. Kerr frowned. What staged footprints? Ewan realized. with quiet disappointment, that the inspector had never questioned them at all. "You've charged Ross," he said, "this morning. When does he appear before the sheriff?" "This afternoon." Kerr straightened his coat. "The case is finished." He climbed into his vehicle and drove away before Ewan could answer. Moss watched the Land Rover disappear. "So do I," Ewan said quietly. "I wish life were that simple." There was only one person left in the village who had known Alistair McRae well. Old Mary Stewart lived alone in a croft overlooking the western shore. People said she remembered everything. They also said she remembered far more than she admitted. She welcomed Ewan with oatcakes and strong coffee before he had asked a single question. "I've been expecting you." "Have you?" "It was only a matter of time." She poured another cup. "You've found the journal." Ewan looked at her carefully. "You knew about it." "I told Father Morrison to hide it." "Why?" "Because people were already lying." She sat heavily by the window, watching the rain drift across the loch. "Alistair McRae wasn't an evil man. I've heard he was respected." "He was. But he made one terrible mistake." "What happened 20 years ago?" For several moments she remained silent. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There was no accident." Ewan felt the room grow still. "What do you mean?" She turned toward him. "Everyone says a young groundskeeper fell from the cliffs during a storm. Didn't he?" "No. He was pushed." The only sound was the ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece. "Who pushed him?" "I never saw." "Who knows?" "4 people." She counted slowly on trembling fingers. "Alistair McRae, Adrian Blackwell, myself, and one other. The killer? I don't know." "You've kept this secret for 20 years." "I kept a promise." "To whom?" "To a dying man." Ewan leaned forward. "The 4th person." Before she could answer, a sharp crack echoed from outside. The front window exploded inward in a shower of glass. Moss barked furiously. A stone rolled across the wooden floor and came to rest at Ewan's feet. Wrapped around it with coarse twine was a single sheet of paper. He untied it. The message had been cut from newspaper print to disguise the handwriting. It contained only one sentence. "Ask about the Piper's Lament if you want to die next." Ewan read the message twice before folding it with deliberate care and slipping it into his notebook. Mary Stewart had gone pale. "They've never done that before," she whispered. "They?" She caught herself too late. Ewan looked at her steadily. "You said they, not someone." The old woman lowered herself into her chair. "When you've carried a secret for 20 years, you stop thinking of one person. You think of the secret itself. It becomes a crowd." He walked to the shattered window. Outside, the lane was empty. Rain hissed against the broken glass. Moss had already bounded into the garden, nose low to the ground. Ewan followed. The collie stopped beside a stone wall where the muddy verge met the road. There were bicycle tracks, fresh ones. They ran east toward the village before disappearing onto the gravel. "A bicycle," Myri said from the doorway. "Not a motor car. No. Who rides a bicycle in weather like this?" Ewan smiled faintly. "Someone who doesn't want an engine announcing their arrival." He crouched beside the tracks. The rear tire had an unusual pattern, a section worn almost smooth. Easy enough to recognize. Harder to connect to a particular bicycle. Not impossible. Nothing ever was. Inspector Kerr arrived 20 minutes later in a foul temper. He surveyed the broken window with theatrical impatience. "So now someone's throwing rocks." "They were aiming at Myri. They missed." "They weren't trying to." Kerr frowned. "What?" "They wanted the message delivered." He held out the paper. Kerr read it, snorted, and handed it back. Local nonsense. It frightened her. Old stories frighten old people. Ewan said nothing. Kerr glanced around the cottage. "You've been filling her head with murder theories." "I've mostly been listening." "Well, stop listening and start helping me." "I thought I was." "The sheriff has remanded Ross in custody." Myri looked up sharply. "The poor man. He'll answer for killing Blackwell." After Kerr departed, Myri waited until the sound of his Land Rover had faded. "He's arresting the wrong soul." "I know. You'd better prove it quickly." The village bicycle repair shed belonged to Archie McLean, who could identify the owner of a tire mark as easily as another man recognized a familiar face. Archie was tightening the chain on a fishing bicycle when Ewan arrived. "Morning." It was until someone broke Mrs. Stewart's window. "So you've heard." "I've got ears." "So I notice." Ewan described the worn tire. Archie rubbed his chin. "That narrows it." "To how many?" "3. "Only 3? Most folk replace worn tires. And the 3? My nephew, the postman, and Archie hesitated. The minister. The minister rides a bicycle? When the church van refuses. Ewan thanked him and turned to leave. Oh, Archie called after him. There's something else. I repaired another bicycle yesterday. I thought there were only 3. This one belonged to a visitor. What sort of visitor? A woman. Wearing blue? Archie's eyebrows lifted. How did you know? I guessed. Blue coat. Blue scarf. When? Late afternoon. The day before Blackwell died. What needed repairing? A puncture. Did she say where she'd come from? Glenfionn House. Instead of returning directly to the station, Ewan climbed the narrow path leading to the cliffs west of the village. According to the journal, this was where the supposed accident had occurred 20 years earlier. The rain had eased into a fine mist. Below, waves struck the rocks with patient rhythm. The cliff edge was narrower than he had imagined. Heather grew almost to the brink. He stood quietly, trying to picture the past. A young groundskeeper, Adrian Blackwell, Alistair McRae, one more witness, a fall that had been called an accident. Unless, his gaze settled on an iron ring set into the rock, old, rusting. It had once anchored ropes for lowering supplies to the shoreline below. Someone had polished it recently, not completely, just enough to expose bright metal beneath the rust. Ewan knelt. Caught beneath the ring was a tiny thread of dark blue wool. Not silk this time. Wool. From a scarf, the same color, the same persistent shade that had followed the investigation from the first morning. Moss began barking, not excitedly, warningly. Ewan rose. Someone stood 50 yards away among the standing stones overlooking the cliff. A woman, blue coat, blue scarf. She watched him without moving. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then she turned and disappeared into the mist. Ewan ran. The path twisted between boulders and gorse. By the time he reached the standing stones, there was no one there. Only wet grass bending in the wind. He searched the ground carefully. No clear footprints. No dropped glove. Nothing. Almost nothing. Wedged beneath one of the stones was a folded sheet of music, protected from the rain. It was an old arrangement of the Piper's Lament. Across the final page, written in a firm hand, were the words, "The tune was never the secret. The fourth witness is." Ewan folded the music and slipped it into his notebook. For the first time since Adrian Blackwell's body had been discovered, he was certain of one thing. The woman in blue did not want him dead. If she had, she could have stayed hidden. Instead, she had led him to another clue, which meant someone else had thrown the stone through Mary Stewart's window. There were now at least 2 people moving through Carron Beag in the shadows, one trying to uncover the truth, and another willing to threaten anyone who came too close to it. The folded sheet of music stayed in Ewan's pocket all the way back to the station. He did not open it again. There was a time for reading and a time for thinking, and he had learnt long ago that doing both at once usually led to neither being done well. Moss trotted beside him, occasionally glancing over his shoulder as though expecting the woman in blue to emerge once more from the mist. She did not. By the time they reached the village, the afternoon rain had given way to pale sunshine. Carron Beag looked almost cheerful again. Smoke curled from cottage chimneys. Children chased one another across the green, and fishermen mended nets outside the harbour. Murder had a curious habit of disturbing only those directly touched by it. Everyone else still needed bread, milk, and tomorrow's weather. Mrs. Morag Sinclair intercepted Ewan before he reached the station. "I've remembered something. I'm relieved. It wasn't yesterday the stranger first came." "The woman in blue?" Mrs. Sinclair nodded vigorously. "I saw her last spring." "Here?" "No." "Where?" "In Inverness." "What were you doing there?" "My sister was having her cataracts done." Ewan smiled. "And naturally you noticed a stranger." "I always notice strangers." "What was she doing?" "Following Adrian Blackwell." "You're certain?" "As certain as I'm standing here." "Did they speak?" "No." "Then how do you know she was following him?" Mrs. Sinclair gave him the patient look, usually reserved for particularly slow schoolchildren. "Because every time he stopped, she stopped." Ewan thanked her. It matched Charlotte Mercer's photographs. The woman had been watching Blackwell for months, perhaps years. Yet she had never approached him openly. That was not how a killer usually behaved. Inside the station, a thin envelope lay waiting beneath the door. No stamp. No address. Someone had delivered it by hand. Inside was a single page torn from an old newspaper. The headline read, "Young groundskeeper dies in cliff fall. 20 years old." The article was brief. The victim's name was Ian MacLeod. The death had been ruled accidental during a storm. At the bottom, someone had circled one sentence in blue ink. The only witnesses were estate owner Alistair McRae and visiting music student Adrian Blackwell. Ewan read the sentence twice, then a third time. According to Mary Stewart, there had been 4 witnesses. The newspaper listed only 2. Someone had erased the others before the story ever reached print. He turned the clipping over. On the back, written in neat handwriting, were 5 words. Find Ian's sister before Kerr does. No signature. No explanation. Only another careful nudge. The woman in blue again? He was beginning to think so. Ian MacLeod's sister lived alone in a stone cottage 6 miles north of the village. Her name was Kirsty MacLeod. She opened the door only a fraction when Ewan knocked. I've spoken to the police already. Not to me. I've nothing to say. I've brought coffee. She blinked. What? He lifted the small paper bag from the hotel. And scones. After a long pause, the door opened wider. I suppose it would be rude to waste them. Half an hour later they sat beside her kitchen fire. She stared into her untouched coffee. I've waited 20 years for someone to ask the right question. What is the right question? Not how Ian died. Ewan remained silent. But why everyone agreed to lie? She looked at him for the first time. My brother didn't fall. I know. He found something. What? I never learned. But he wrote to me. She disappeared upstairs and returned carrying a faded envelope. I've kept this hidden. Inside was a letter, written in hurried handwriting. Kirsty, if anything happens to me, don't believe what they tell you, Mr. McRae isn't the man people think he is, but he isn't the one I'm afraid of. There's another visitor staying at the house. He keeps asking questions about the old chapel beneath the west wing. The letter ended there. No name. No date beyond the year. Ewan looked up. Glenfean House has an old chapel. So they say. I've never seen one. It was sealed after the fire. What fire? Kirsty frowned. Haven't they told you? No. The west wing burned the winter after Ian died. That explains something. The estate plans stolen from the church. If someone wanted to find a hidden chapel beneath the west wing, the old maps would become very valuable indeed. As dusk settled over the loch, Ewan walked alone through Glenfean House. Inspector Kerr had released the building after finishing what he called the important work. To Ewan's relief, that meant it was almost empty. The west wing was colder than the rest of the house. Renovation had barely begun there. Charred beams still showed beneath newer plaster. He wandered slowly along the corridor, until Moss stopped before an enormous oak bookcase. The collie sniffed insistently at its base. What is it? Ewan pressed gently against the shelves. Nothing. He examined the floor. One section of the wooden boards was less worn than the others, recently disturbed. He knelt. Hidden beneath the edge of an old rug was a small iron ring set into the floor. He pulled. With a groan of old hinges, a narrow trapdoor lifted. Cold air drifted upward, carrying the unmistakable smell of damp stone. A staircase descended into darkness. So, Ewan murmured, there really was a chapel. He lit his torch and started down. The steps ended in a vaulted chamber carved from ancient stone. It was far older than the house above. Broken pews lay scattered across the floor. A cracked stone altar stood against the far wall, and beside it, a fresh lantern. Still warm. Someone had been there only minutes before. Moss growled. The sound echoed through the underground chamber. Then another sound answered from somewhere deeper in the darkness. Footsteps, slow, measured, not retreating, coming toward them. The footsteps did not hurry. They echoed steadily through the underground passage, accompanied by the faint scrape of leather against damp stone. Whoever was approaching knew the way well enough to walk without hesitation. Ewan switched off his torch. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Moss remained perfectly still beside him, ears forward, his low growl fading into silence. The footsteps came closer. A lantern appeared first, its yellow light creeping around the corner before the person carrying it emerged. It was not the woman in blue. It was Father Ian Morrison. He stopped so abruptly that the lantern swung in a wide arc. Constable, you seem surprised. I might say the same. For several moments neither man spoke. Then Ewan stepped back into the lantern light. I thought this chapel was sealed. So did everyone else, except you. The priest sighed. I've been coming here for years, looking for something. No. Then why? To make sure no one else found it. Ewan glanced around the chamber. What exactly were you protecting? Father Morrison raised the lantern toward the altar. There, behind it stood a narrow oak cabinet, blackened with age. Its brass lock had been forced open recently. The doors hung crooked on their hinges. It wasn't like that yesterday, the priest whispered. So someone got here first. He nodded sadly. They've taken it. What? A small iron cash box. What was inside? Letters. From whom? Alistair McRae. Ewan felt a familiar tightening in his chest. The missing piece. I feared so. The priest looked genuinely distressed. I should have destroyed them years ago. Why didn't you? Because they weren't mine. The cabinet contained only one item that had escaped the thief's attention, a folded sheet of music. Ewan unfolded it carefully. It was another arrangement of the Piper's Lament, but unlike the one found beneath the standing stones, this copy was covered with handwritten notes, not musical notes, names. Each verse had a different name written beside it. Alistair McRae, Ian MacLeod, Adrian Blackwell. The final verse had been left blank, as though someone had intended to add another name later. Father Morrison looked away. I've seen that before. When? The night Alistair died. He showed it to you. He asked me to burn it. You didn't. I couldn't understand why it mattered. Ewan studied the page again. The names were not random. Each had been written in different ink, different handwriting, added over many years. Not all at once. Almost like a record. Or a promise. A sharp whistle echoed faintly from somewhere above. Father Morrison stiffened. What is it? The caretaker. How do you know? He always whistles the same tune. It was not an ordinary whistle. It carried the unmistakable melody of the Piper's Lament. 3 notes. A pause. Then the final phrase. Ewan's eyes narrowed. That's the first time anyone has played the tune without warning someone. The priest looked puzzled. What do you mean? Every other mention of it has been a threat. He hurried toward the staircase. Moss was already climbing. When they emerged into the west wing, Angus Campbell came running down the corridor, breathless. They've taken her. Ewan caught his arm. Who? The journalist? Charlotte Mercer? They forced her into a car. When? 5 minutes ago. Did you see who? No. But, what? They left something. Angus held out a folded concert ticket. On the back was written a single line. Bring the music. Come alone. Midnight. The Cliffs. Inspector Kerr dismissed the kidnapping before Ewan had finished explaining. She's a reporter. Yes. They disappear all the time chasing stories. She didn't disappear voluntarily. How do you know? They left a message. Kerr glanced at the ticket. A prank. They knew about the music. What music? Ewan did not answer. He had learnt enough to know that the fewer people who knew about the hidden chapel, the better. Kerr folded his arms. I've had quite enough of ghost stories. A woman's missing, and Ross is still my murderer. You've no evidence. I've more than you've got. The inspector marched out, slamming the station door behind him. Moss watched him leave before giving a quiet huff. I know, Ewan said. He's not listening. Night settled heavily over Loch Carron. Clouds hid the moon. The cliffs became black shapes against a darker sea. At 11:30, Ewan climbed the narrow path alone, or so anyone watching would believe. Moss had disappeared into the heather 20 minutes earlier, circling toward the cliff from another direction, as he had been trained to do. Ewan carried only a lantern and the annotated copy of the Piper's Lament. The wind rose steadily as midnight approached. At the edge of the old standing stones, a figure stepped from the darkness. A woman. Blue coat, blue scarf. She raised one hand. Don't come any closer. Her voice was calm, educated, not frightened. You've been leaving me clues, because you were the only policeman asking the right questions. Who are you? My name is Anna MacLeod. Ewan stopped. Ian MacLeod's daughter. He blinked. Kirsty told me Ian had only a sister. She lied. Why? To protect me. The wind whipped her scarf around her face. My father died before I was born. She looked toward the sea. I've spent my whole life trying to learn who killed him. You've been following Adrian Blackwell. He knew. Did he kill your father? Anna shook her head. No. Then why was he murdered? Before she could answer, a slow clap echoed from the darkness behind the standing stones. Another figure emerged. Then another. Charlotte Mercer stood between them, her hands tied, but otherwise unharmed. The man holding her arm smiled pleasantly. I was wondering, he said, how long it would take you to put the pieces together, Constable. Ewan recognized him instantly. He was not a stranger. He had been in Glenfionn House from the very beginning. Quiet, helpful, almost invisible. Angus Campbell, the caretaker. He gave a small, mocking bow. "I suppose it's finally time someone told you what really happened 20 years ago." Angus Campbell's pleasant smile never quite reached his eyes. The wind swept across the cliff top, carrying the restless sound of the sea below. Charlotte Mercer stood rigid, her wrists bound but her expression steady. Anna MacLeod kept her gaze fixed on the caretaker, not with fear, but with the exhausted certainty of someone who had chased the same shadow for years. Ewan did not move closer. People expecting a dramatic charge often overlooked a quiet man who simply stood and listened. "You've worked hard to keep everyone looking in the wrong direction," Ewan said. Angus gave a small shrug. "It wasn't difficult. People prefer exciting lies to ordinary truths." "And what is the ordinary truth?" That Adrian Blackwell finally remembered. The caretaker glanced toward the dark outline of Glenfionn House. 20 years changes a man. It doesn't always erase his conscience. Ewan let the silence stretch. It was Angus who filled it. Blackwell came back to recover the letters. He wanted to confess before opening his ridiculous music retreat. The letters from the chapel. Exactly. He didn't find them. No. So he began asking questions. Angus smiled thinly. He was becoming inconvenient. Anna stepped forward. "You murdered him. I prevented an old scandal from becoming a new one. You pushed my father from the cliff." For the first time, Angus's expression hardened. "No." The answer came quickly. Too quickly. Ewan noticed it. "You didn't push Ian MacLeod," he said quietly. Angus looked at him. "No. But you know who did." The caretaker laughed softly. "There it is. Everyone says Highland policemen are slow. You've never answered the question I didn't ask." Angus's smile faded. "You were at the cliff that night. I arrived afterward. You helped cover it up. I helped an old man keep his estate together. The old man being Alistair McRae." Angus nodded once. McRae didn't intend to kill the boy. Charlotte looked from one man to the other. "What happened?" Ewan answered before Angus could. "Ian MacLeod discovered something beneath the west wing." "The chapel," Charlotte said. "No. Something hidden there." Angus closed his eyes. "A ledger." Ewan had suspected as much. "The estate accounts." "Not accounts," Angus replied. "Proof." 20 years earlier, Alistair McRae had uncovered evidence that his late business partner had quietly stolen from local crofters through fraudulent leases. Ashamed that the deception had continued under his ownership, McRae intended to expose it and repay the families. Only 4 people knew. McRae, young Adrian Blackwell, then a gifted music student staying at the house, Ian MacLeod, who accidentally found the hidden records, and Angus Campbell, the estate's young assistant caretaker. When Ian insisted the truth should be made public immediately, tempers flared on the cliff path during a violent storm. McRae tried to stop him from leaving. Ian stumbled. McRae reached for him. Too late. The young groundskeeper fell. It had been a tragic accident, not murder. The lie came afterward. McRae, horrified, allowed the death to be called accidental to spare Ian's family further pain and to avoid destroying every crofter's confidence in the estate before restitution could be made. Blackwell agreed to remain silent. Angus did not. He secretly removed the ledger before anyone else could see it. With the evidence hidden, he began quietly blackmailing McRae for years. When McRae died, Angus believed the secret had died with him. Then Adrian Blackwell returned. He remembered where the letters were hidden, Ewan said. And he intended to tell the police. Angus gave a weary nod. "I couldn't allow that." "So you arranged the study, the footprints, the broken bagpipes, the open window. You made it look like robbery." Angus looked almost offended. It was convincing. It was almost convincing. Ewan reached into his pocket and held up the dry umbrella tag he had removed from the stand at Glenfionn House. "You overlooked one thing." Angus frowned. "You entered through the front door after the rain had stopped." He produced the fragment of blue silk. "You planted evidence pointing towards someone else. Then the concert program. The anonymous notes. Finally, the marked copy of the Piper's Lament. You kept trying to control the story." Angus stared at the pages. "So many little things." "In villages," Ewan replied, "little things are usually the important ones." The caretaker's shoulders sagged. The confidence drained from him. "I never meant to kill Blackwell." "No?" He refused to stay silent. "What happened?" "I confronted him." Angus's voice became almost distant. He laughed. He said 20 years of fear had been enough. "I struck him. Only once. He fell against the hearth." Silence followed. "I thought he'd stand up, but he didn't." Angus lowered his head. "I've been lying ever since." Behind the standing stones came the sharp bark of moss. A moment later, 2 local constables emerged, followed reluctantly by Inspector Kerr, whose face suggested he had expected another wild goose chase, and had instead walked into a confession. Kerr looked from Angus to Ewan. Has he admitted it? Angus answered himself. Yes. The inspector blinked. Oh. He seemed almost disappointed that the matter had become straightforward. After a long pause, he cleared his throat. I'll take charge from here. Of course, Ewan said. Charlotte caught Ewan's eye and hid a smile. Over the following week, the truth emerged with far less drama than the rumors had predicted. The hidden estate records were recovered from a concealed compartment beneath the caretaker's workshop, confirming the decades-old fraud and allowing compensation to be paid to the affected families. Ian MacLeod's death was officially recognized as a fatal accident concealed by panic and misplaced loyalty rather than deliberate murder. Angus Campbell was charged with the murder of Adrian Blackwell, and with offences arising from his long campaign of blackmail and deception. Inspector Kerr held a lengthy press conference in Inverness, speaking confidently about the success of the investigation and carefully avoiding any mention of how the crucial confession had been obtained. Ewan did not object. Promotion often arrived disguised as praise. He preferred neither. Charlotte Mercer published her article several weeks later. It focused less on the sensational crime than on how a small Highland village had carried the weight of an old secret for too long. She never mentioned Ewan by name, referring only to a local constable who understood that listening is often more powerful than questioning. That suited him perfectly. Anna MacLeod remained in Carronbeag long enough to visit her father's grave. She placed a small set of fresh heather beside the stone, and for the first time in her life, left without unanswered questions. One quiet afternoon, with the investigation concluded, and the paperwork strategically delayed until someone from headquarters began asking awkward questions, Ewan sat outside the station, with a mug of strong coffee. Moss lay asleep in the sunshine. Fishing boats drifted lazily across Loch Carron. Mrs. Murrag Sinclair paused on her way past. So, she asked, was it murder after all? Ewan considered the loch for a moment. It was. And the old mystery. That was something sadder. She nodded thoughtfully before continuing down the road, no doubt to improve the story before repeating it to everyone else. Ewan smiled to himself. The village was gossiping again. The hills stood exactly where they had always stood. The wind carried nothing more threatening than the distant cry of gulls. For the first time in days, there was nowhere in particular he needed to be. He lifted his coffee, scratched moss behind the ears, and watched the mist drift peacefully across the water, content that the Highlands had reclaimed their quiet, and equally content that someone else would almost certainly receive the credit.